You're a Christian, and you're looking for videos to confirm your Christianity, so you hop on YouTube and search Christian apologetics, and you come across this video. You may have heard of Christian apologetics somewhere along your Christian walk, that apologetics is defending the faith and giving evidences for why you believe what you believe. However, Christian apologetics is not taken seriously in academic arenas. In this video, Wayne will explain why Christian apologetics is considered pseudo-scholarship and why Christianity needs to be more acquainted with critical scholarship. Christian apologists are not equipped to answer the tough questions critical scholars bring up, and people are beginning to see the chinks in the Christian apologists' armor.
Alright guys, so welcome to the channel, welcome to the video. My name is Wayne, I'm your host for the evening or morning or whatever time of day it is your time. And yes, I do have gripes with Christian apologetics, and I'll just jump straight into it. So for those of you guys who don't know what Christian apologetics is a form of defending your faith. And there are different forms of apologetics. So you could be a Christian apologist or a Muslim apologist or a abortion apologist. The apologists come in all different types of forms, and an apologist is somebody who defends a position. So you have Christian apologists, and Christian apologists, they usually are people's first line of defense when people want to learn more about the Christian faith. When people want to learn more about the Christian faith, people might come across a Christian apologist video, like a Frank Turk video or a William Lane Craig video. And that is people's first introduction to defending the Christian faith. But there are not just Christian apologists, but you also have Christian academics and Christian scholars. So I would consider myself a Christian academic. I'm not a Christian apologist. I'm a Christian academic. I'm a Christian scholar. I'm a scholar who happens to be a Christian, but Christian apologists are not scholars. And my issue is that a lot of people are learning about Christian apologetics, but they're not evolving and they're not maturing so they can graduate from Christian apologetics into Christian academia. And the danger in this is Christian apologetics a lot of times give people a false sense of information, a false sense of security. People feel like they know about the Bible or they know about Christianity a lot more than what they do. So an example of this is most people who study Christian apologetics, they probably don't know much about Judaism. And sorry to say, but Christianity is a Jewish religion. People who study Christian apologetics probably wouldn't know much about where the concept of a Jewish Messiah came from. They probably wouldn't know much about the Second Temple period of Judaism or the First Temple period of Judaism. And so these are some of my gripes with Christian apologetics, which is really important because if you want to have an in-depth knowledge on your faith, these are academic points or references that you need to study more. If you are a Christian, but you don't know about First Temple Judaism, First Temple Judaism is dealing with when the first Jewish temple was standing. If you don't know about First Temple Judaism, if you don't know about Second Temple Judaism, after the first Jewish temple was destroyed, the second Jewish temple was built. So if you don't know anything about First Temple Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, if you don't know much about maybe the Hasmonean dynasty, or if you don't know anything about first century Second Temple Judaism, these are things that you want to know about. And people are learning about Christian apologetics, but they're not learning about all the other stuff in between. And then you have literary and textual criticism. And that field of study is so neglected by Christian apologists. You can study Christian apologetics as much as you want, but once you get into the field of literary criticism, textual criticism, or intertextuality, all fields that you learn about when you go to a really good seminary or a really good ancient Near East department. Once you get into these fields of study, you may know about Christian apologetics, but the stuff you're going to learn about in those fields, Christian apologetics can't really prepare you for. And so the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is because the next segment of my video, I want to talk about some things that Christian apologists can't deal with and they usually do not deal with. Christian apologists usually cannot deal with academic consensuses like the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis, for people who don't know, it's a hypothesis that was proposed in 1848 by a guy named Julius Wellhausen. Julius Wellhausen proposed the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis is a hypothesis that says that the Torah wasn't written by Moses, but the Torah is compiled of 4 different source texts. So these source texts are titled J, E, P, and D. So when you read through Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 uses the name Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. Well, because Genesis 1 and a lot of other texts in the Torah, at certain times, these texts only refer to God as Elohim, only. Well, we took those texts and we attributed those texts that only refer to God as Elohim. We attributed those texts to the what we call the Elohist source, right? So then in Genesis chapter 2, the Bible uses the term Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. And there are texts in the Hebrew Bible that only call God Yahweh. So we took those texts that only call God Yahweh and we attributed that to the Yahweh source. And so we attribute that to what's called the J source. The reason why we call it the J source is because the guy who made the hypothesis, he was German. And so in German, Yehovah turns into Jehovah. So we attribute the Yehovah or Jehovah text to the J source, and we attribute the Elohim text to the Elohist source text. Then you have the priestly source, which is titled P. Then you have the Deuteronomist source, which is titled D. So those sources make up JEPD. And then you have something called the redactor, and the redactor is the person who took these 4 source texts. So let me keep explaining. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were originally 2 separate texts. They were originally 2 separate source texts, and a redactor came and added these 2 texts together. A redactor came, or an editor came, and he redacted, or he put Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 together so that they could tell one story. So this is why a lot of stories in the Hebrew Bible, they don't make sense, or they even contradict. And there are real contradictions in the Hebrew Bible, like in Genesis 6, God tells Moses to bring 2 of every animal. In Genesis 7, then God changes his mind and he says, bring 7 of every animal. Well, the reason why that's in there is because there was a redactor who put Genesis 6 and Genesis 7 together when they were 2 separate source texts originally. And this is what Christian apologists don't deal with. They can't deal with. This is high level academic material that people cannot deal with. Christian apologists can't deal with. And this is my gripe with Christian apologetics. So I'm going to be playing a video talking about these source texts and talking about the 2 creation stories. And long story short, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they are 2 separate creation stories that were redacted together. And Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are 2 separate views of God. Genesis 2 is about a view of God where the person or the source who writes this text, they view God as Yahweh. So this text was written by a Yahwehist. That's why they call God Yahweh over and over and over again, because the point of view of the person who wrote the text is a Yahwehist. And from an academic perspective, you could even say that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are 2 different gods. So if you look in Genesis chapter 2, when Yahweh makes Adam with his hands. He makes Eve with his hands. He's walking with Adam in the cool of the day. But notice in Genesis chapter 1, Yahweh is making the world with his voice, and Yahweh is hovering above water. He's hovering now. So Genesis 2, God is doing things with his hands, and he's walking with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve hear God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So what it looks like is Genesis chapter 2 God actually has a corporeal body. And the reason why we don't see that today is because we've been trained to not see that. We have been told from the time that we were little itty babies that God doesn't have a physical form. But the Yahwehists, they believe that God has a body. And the Elohist doesn't. The Elohist believes that God doesn't have a body. El or Elohim doesn't have a body, and he's hovering above water. So the Yahwehists, they have the earliest view of God, and their view of God, he's pretty much a divine man, and he's walking around in the garden. And this starts to make sense of things that we see in Exodus when Moses says, "Let me see your face." And Yahweh says, "You can't see my face or you'll die, but I'll pass by you and you can see my back." And by the way, that is a Yahweh text in Exodus 33, verse 20.
El was the high god, the equivalent of On from Mesopotamia, the father of the gods. And we know that this was the God of the Israelites because that's where they get the name. Israel means wrestles with El. And when Jacob, in Genesis gets the name for the first time, the first thing he does is go over to, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the quote here. He goes over to Bethel, the town of Bethel, which means house of El, and he builds an altar. And on the altar, he writes the words El Eloi Israel, which means El is the God of Israel, with no mention of Yahweh anywhere. And this is deep in the Bronze Age, or deep in the second millennium at some point. I mean, that's when these stories take place. And there's, we have lots of evidence of El. El is a very well-known, well-documented God from across the Near East. Like I said, the same as On from Mesopotamia. He's the high God above the pantheon, the father of all the gods. And his wife is the mother goddess, is Asherah. That's his mate. That's his spouse. And their son Baal was the king of the gods, just like the Canaanite Zeus, basically, or the Canaanite Marduk. So El, according to various traditions, including the Bible, it says El has 70 sons, or El and Asherah together have 70 sons. The question becomes for biblical scholars is that we do know that Yahweh and El ultimately get fused into one God, because this is why we have two names of God in the Bible. You've got God and the Lord, because God in English translates back to Elohim, which is plural for gods. And then the Lord, which is always capitalized, translates back to Yahweh. And this is why you've got both words and both names, is because they're originally two separate gods. And you also see the name El all over the place in the text.
3 ancient facts about the Bible you can only learn from these books. The ancient Israelites used to believe in a flat earth. Above the earth was a solid dome, and inside of the dome were windows. This was called the firmament. When Genesis 1 verse 2 says, "The Spirit of God hovered over the waters," that isn't talking about the sea. That's talking about the waters ancient people thought were above the firmament. When Adam says to Eve she is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, the nation of Israel says those same words to King David in 2 Samuel 5 verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh." Want to learn more? Get the 3-volume set of Secrets of the Bible through the link in my profile.
Just used standalone El Shaddai, aside from these town names. El Shaddai is one of the titles. And so, so El was being worshipped there. So then you've got this revolutionary cult. And at some point, El and Yahweh get fused together. And certainly by the time you get to the written Torah in the Second Temple, they've already been fused. But nobody really knows at what point they've been fused. Biblical tradition maintains that they were fused all the way immediately at the time of Moses. So that would be in the 13th century BC. A lot of traditionalists will assume anyway, that they were syncretized early on. I'm frankly not convinced that they were syncretized early on, or even syncretized in the First Temple at all. Maybe they were in the minds of some of the radical Yahwists. That may well be, but it would have been later in the history of the First Temple, like after the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah. And it would have only been in the minds of this one small cult, because El was a widely worshipped god all the way through the first millennium. So even if in the minds of the Yahwists, they've fused Yahweh and El. I mean, they're just a minority little group in one small country, just in Judah, which is just like a small little place. I personally don't think that they were syncretized early on. I think when you just look at the biblical narrative on its own, you make it pretty clear that they start the reforms in the 9th century. That's when they start overthrowing. There's three queen mothers that get overthrown. A battle on Mount Carmel with the prophet Isaiah against the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And Isaiah prevails. This is all during the kingship of Ahab, who was a historical person, mind you. Ahab is a well-attested historical figure. He was an important leader at the time. He's no chump historically. He was a pretty accomplished warrior king. And Jezebel was a historical figure as well. So on the Battle of Mount Carmel, Isaiah, the prophet of Yahweh, or no, it's not Isaiah, it's Elijah. Sorry, get my prophets confused. It's Elijah. He prevails on Mount Carmel. It's a famous story. And then they proceed to kill the 400 prophets of Baal, but they don't mention the prophets of Asherah, who presumably go unmolested because they were still quite powerful. So that is Yahweh fighting with Baal. You can't say Yahweh has been fused with El when he's still waging this coup against Baal, because Yahweh is trying to become the new king of the gods. He's got to take out Baal first. And then he's going to take Baal's titles, Rider on the Storm. He's going to take the title of Lord, because Baal was Lord. It used to be that you said, they talk about this in the book Hosea. The prophet Hosea talks about this, that he says his wife, you will no longer call me my Baali, you will call me my Ishi. And that was like a Yahwist term, but my Baali means my Lord. Baal was a turn of phrase for Lord that they used all the time, and that they're a common figure of speech and for those folks. So they're using the term all the time. And so Yahweh, the cult of Yahweh, is trying to overthrow this cult of Baal in the 9th century and still fighting with Baal. So I don't think you can make the case that he's been fused with El at this point.